Welcome back, or welcome to, if this is your first session with us for our training seminar on becoming a Microsoft Azure administrator. This is session 5 of 6, and it's called Azure Administration Skills Development, Theory and Practice. It's one of my very favorite subjects in the world, actually, study skills. So let's take a look at our agenda items for the next hour or so. I'm going to help you in this hour in a very concrete, practical, boots-on-the-ground way. Develop your Pluralsight learning plan. Now, what you learn from may go beyond Pluralsight, but obviously I'm going to focus on Pluralsight, at least principally. And I'm also going to share my own personal tips and tricks for using Pluralsight courses for maximum benefit. Because, I was a Pluralsight subscriber before I became a contract trainer, and I've been a full-time author with Pluralsight now for over 5 years now, I think closer to 6. And I still consume every bit as much courseware as a student as I did ever. So I've got some good stuff to share there. And then the other half of this presentation is developing hands-on skill with Azure. Given that Azure is a business and it has a business model, it's a consumption-priced system, how can you, with minimal or maybe even no financial investment, get some time in the Azure portal or at an authenticated command prompt, let's say, to build up your hands-on skills? Because I've mentioned kind of as a theme throughout this seminar series that I think your success as an Azure administrator is going to hinge on 3 interdependent skills. There's understanding the concepts and the theory. There's putting that into practical application in a hands-on way. And then if you're interested in certification, there's the whole subject of how to be an efficient learner, tips, tricks for clearing these exams and earning these badges and using them to best effect in your career. So with that, let's get started here. This is, as usual, our overview slide that shows how far we've come from the first episode on shifting your paradigm. And then we looked at Azure through 3 different lenses, didn't we? Overall, we're looking at the job role of the Azure administrator. And I figured I'd start us in session 2 with infrastructure as a service, because in my experience, most IT professionals and sysadmins are comfortable with virtual machines. In session 3, we turned our attention to hosted platform services, and we did a lot of comparison and contrast between those. It's not an either-or proposition. It can be in time, but both and works just as well. In session 4, I wanted to devote some time to DevOps because it's a leading software development practice, and also because it fits in the Azure world. There's Azure DevOps, and also because, well, it blends in everything else we've been doing thus far. Today we're doing skills development focusing on theory and practice, and this is going to contrast with what we'll do in the final 6th episode. I want to reserve certification for a whole episode. Today will be about skills development. Next week about how to take those skills and focus them with laser efficiency on your certification goals. So good stuff. That having been said, if you have any questions today about certification, pop them in, send them on over. I'm willing to and happy to entertain all your questions, no matter what the subject. Of course, if it gets too far afield, I may not be able to answer it, but certification is certainly on the table. Here we have a short link to the session materials, timw.info/admin. And that's going to take you, as usual, out to one of my GitHub repositories. Here it is right here. And I've updated it since last week. I got a little bit behind. I realized today when I uploaded the session 5 PDF that I forgot to upload the session 4 one. I'm sorry about that, but it's there now. And there's also, besides those PDFs of my slide deck, there's some links documents, as well as a Visio reference diagram that we'll probably take a look at today as we go along in the demo portion. But anyway, you don't have to be a GitHub member or subscriber to get these files. I know I always explain this, but you can open this clone or download button and just download all the files as a zip if you'd like. All right, Areno. Well, let's proceed here. Design your Pluralsight learning plan. This is probably the most important question I have for you today. What is your learning style? How aware and cognizant are you of how you learn? really. That's what I call step 0. Before we get into action steps of practically how you can start to amass Azure Administrator knowledge, skills, and hands-on experience, take a moment to inventory how you've learned over time. Think back ever since childhood, let's say, and even not necessarily formal subjects. Think about your hobbies and personal interests, how you've geeked out on those. How do you pick up knowledge most efficiently? And without getting too into the waters of instructional design, there's a common learning style model. The acronym is VARK, V-A-R-K. Visual is V, and this is going to be a person who is very visual. My wife, Susan, is definitely a V learner. Images, maps, infographics, mind maps, being able to see a composite. I'm a visual learner myself, come to think about it. When you're thinking of Azure, I immediately start to think of topology diagrams and how useful they are because you can see kind of the big picture. I'm just a huge fan of that particular style of learning. Auditory learners learn by listening and talking. I'm also that too. I find that I consume probably 75% of the Pluralsight and other computer-based training courses that I study as a student. I would say 75% of that time is just audio, where I'm just listening to the audio stream of the training. And that's great for me because it's so convenient. I could be walking my dog, I could be exercising, I could be doing housework, whatever, and I've got that useful information stream coming in. Auditory learner would also benefit through talking, interaction with an instructor. And I know that computer-based training isn't for everybody. Again, to use my wife Susan as an example, she, by her own admission, isn't a good fit for computer-based training because she really benefits from live interaction, not only with the instructor, but also with other peers. And I totally vibe and get that and honor that and appreciate that. The R is reading and or writing. This would be old school, reading physical print books, ebooks, websites, note-taking, maybe designing some mind maps. I'm a big fan of mind mapping. And, you know, that's there. And then finally, kinesthetic, which is a fancy word to denote experimentation, activities, hands-on practice. Now, what I want to stress here is that it's very likely that you're a strong learner in more than one of these categories. I'm really grateful to say I'm pretty equally balanced across all 4 of those, and that's a good thing. But if you're not, I think it's still a good thing for you to identify where you do benefit the best and then hone in on mechanisms to learn the Azure Administrator skill set, leveraging those models. Okay, what I would recommend in using our stuff at Pluralsight to attain your Azure Administrator skill set looks like this. And if you've been with me through the preceding sessions of the seminar series, this is kind of a review. Remember, we've got this machine learning backend called Iris. And for each of these job roles, we're talking about Azure Administrator, of course, there are a number of skill IQs, which are assessment tests that are going to be adaptive. If you answer a kind of steps up of complexity, and if you're answering those questions correctly, it's going to ramp up the difficulty. And if you're starting to miss items, it ramps down. So it dynamically adapts to you. And then you're going to get your study plan of what you're stronger in and what you're weaker in and what courses fit in within the Azure Administrator job role. The role IQ takes as its input the output of your skill IQs, and you get an overall level, you see. So skill IQs, you're in the job role. I think there's 4 skill IQs in the Azure Administrator role IQ. And so this is good, as I've explained a number of times over the last several weeks, because number 1, just for your own benefit, you're able to identify clearly your stronger and weaker areas and buff up those weaker areas. But just as importantly, you're getting quantitative feedback as well. And this can be extremely important if you need to document that, say for your next performance review at your current job. You can print these reports, and if you're part of a business that has an enterprise subscription, your plan administrator is able to get all your metadata anyway, but it's nice, I think. I like to have quantitative justification of what I'm saying. You know, what's that old saw? Measure twice, cut once, and trust, verify, etc., etc., etc. So besides the iris, skill IQ, role IQ stuff, then it comes down to a number of courses. And like I said, we can double check in the demo, but I think there's 4 paths, 4 skill paths underneath Azure Administrator. And those in turn are going to be a library of courses divided into beginner, intermediate, or advanced level skill. And you may realize that you want to go through all of them. And there's lots of tools in our web player that allow you to organize those. There's bookmarking, there's creating channels. So you can make sure that as you're completing each of these courses and modules, you know where you are and you can pick up where you left off, etc. You might know if you've studied any of our courses, each module in a course will have a brief assessment. I think it's called a knowledge check or a learning check. Those aren't meant to be analogous to the CERT exams. Please understand that all this stuff really on this slide is independent from the Microsoft certification exams. Here we're talking about pure skill development and knowledge development. And those module-based assessments are written intentionally to be, I don't want to use the term basic or fundamental, but just basically just to keep your brain engaged. You know, they're not meant, I've say this because I've talked to people who have thought, I thought that those were supposed to be practice exams. No, that's something quite different, as a matter of fact. And speaking of which, there are the practice certification exams that you can benefit from that are modeled after, say, the Microsoft certification exams. We'll dive into that very deep in the final session next week. So here's a couple screenshots from the Pluralsight web player, and as I said, the Microsoft Azure Administrator Role IQ. You can see, let me bring over my mouse. Forgot about my drawing tools here. Anyway, I guess I'll just have to use my mouse for now. This Role IQ badge is going to change as it adapts, and it will dynamically adapt based on your movement through the different courses in the different skill IQs. The Role IQ badge will adapt accordingly. I think there's 4 levels to Role IQ. You have to check our docs about that to get details, but that's the long and the short of it here. Quantitative measured progress is what we're looking at here. Now, what if you're not a Pluralsight subscriber? What if you don't plan to be a paid Pluralsight subscriber? You should know, if you don't already know, that we've got a pretty nice BFF relationship with Microsoft going, particularly a whole bunch of Azure content that's free. I'm pretty sure you have to create a Pluralsight account. I wish I could speak in more details about the account stuff. I just teach. But I do know that, you know, and you can get to the Azure Pluralsight partnership content from our website as well as the Microsoft site. If you look in the lower left corner of this slide, timw.info/AZ free. So, hey, you can't beat that price, can you? All right, so what are some practical tips in using, say, the Pluralsight web player? One question I receive pretty regularly from learners is, how can I get your exercise files? I've gotten the question so often that now, as a matter of course, in the beginning of every one of my Pluralsight courses, I intentionally inject a little piece of how to get to those files. But I want to mention it here just because it's relevant, and also because this is one of the things that you have to be on the full web player to do, as opposed to a mobile app or the Apple TV app, the Amazon app, whatever. So in the web player, there we go, you default to the table of contents page that has your modules and your clips. If you go on over to exercise files, you can pull down a zip. Now, again, some of the courses, like our development courses and certainly our InfoSec courses, may have files that could flag your corporate firewall. That's another discussion, but I just want to mention that. Now, of course, we check all of our files and vet our files, but that's something to consider. If you're not able to get a download of your exercise files, you might want to talk to your plan administrator or your network people at your organization. What I put in, it's really up to the author what they do with their exercise files. What I do with mine, will always give a PDF of the slides, and that's nice to have as a reference. And I tend to put any supplemental script files that I might use in my training, as well as I historically do a links list. So whenever I call out references in the training, just to save some jotting down and that kind of stuff, I put them in there. All right, so that's exercise files. As I mentioned, some other things you can do in the web player is bookmark the course, which is just what you think. Your courses show up in the bookmarked area. But you can also create what's called a channel. And I have to confess, even though I'm a full-time Pluralsight employee, my understanding of channel, it's one of those situations where you probably use 5% of its capability. I like channel because I can take all the courses that I want to queue up and put them under a single name. I guess there's some social media stuff that you can do. I guess you can make your channel public. You can share it with your colleagues and team, your friends, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But these are all mechanisms just to get your courses all lined up and ready to actually start to consume, all right? Okay. Oh, that's right, transcript. Yeah, this is kind of cool. When you're searching for content, consider that you can do a Control F and search the transcript of the course, because we've got closed captioning for all of our courses. And I believe they're localized in multiple languages. Don't take my word as golden on that, but I'm pretty sure that we've got at least some localization, language localization going with those. But that can be cool if you're looking for the proverbial needle in a haystack. I need to know about pass-through authentication and Azure AD Connect. Well, you may be able to get, using not just the Pluralsight site search could get you maybe to the course, you can search through the transcript to look for occurrences of the word or phrase, okay? This here is particularly important for me as a learner. Our mobile apps, iOS, Android apps. There's also Apple TV and I guess Amazon Fire, I guess it's called. I do have an Apple TV and use that sometimes, but mostly I use the mobile app on my iPhone. And what I want to call out to you here are things like the ability to download the courses, as long as you've got the room on your device, which is obviously convenient because you don't have to be online to consume the course. And if you're away from a Wi-Fi hotspot, you don't have to worry about streaming potentially big media files over your cellular connection. So you can download and organize your courses locally on your device, play them within the player. I'm a big fan that the player will work in the background. Now, what I'm saying here is all just iOS. I'm an iPhone user. I'd love to hear your experiences using the Android app if it's the same. But, you know, some media player apps on iOS don't play in the background. That really annoys me to no end. I'm grateful to report that ours does. So your phone, you can flip off the screen and it continues to play. What are some other things? Yeah, and headphones. Like I said, your mileage may vary, of course, but I rarely will need to look at the screen. And that really, it depends on the course. What I would suggest, if you want to just maybe benefit from my particular workflow, if I'm studying a subject in Azure, let's say, and I'm brand new to it, then the audio stream's not going to work because I need to have a picture in my head to go with it. So I will watch the content then. But once I at least have some initial familiarity with the subject, certainly for review, then I'm golden for audio because as the instructor is going through his or her demos, I know what it looks like, at least basically in my mind, so I'm able to keep up and follow along. And that method has served me really, really well over the years as a learner. Something else, if you look in the upper right, the fact that, and this is across all of our players, you can adjust the playback speed. I've been told that my voice is particularly good at like 1.4, I think. I mean, some instructors speak quickly out of the box. Others speak slowly for your preferences. It's wonderful to be able to speed up or speed down. Sometimes I'll speed up just to the point where I almost have a difficulty following, just in the interest of time, if you're experiencing a time crunch and you need to get through the material in time. And then lastly, you can cast from your mobile device. If you've got an Amazon Fire Stick or some kind of set-top box with your TV, you can cast out. And I do that pretty regularly as well, being able to take advantage of a larger monitor while it's still playing from your smart device. I think those are the big things that have jumped out to me about using our stuff in a mobile context. Again, I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback and your questions as we go along. Let me bring my mouse over to the correct monitor and let's proceed. All right, now what if you're more of a reader-writer type of learner? This is pretty controversial, isn't it? Printed books aren't a good fit for Microsoft Azure, and I'm somebody who's written a couple Azure books, and I'm saying that myself. It's just my opinion, take it or leave it. But the issue I've seen with printed books with Azure is that Azure moves way too quickly for any traditional book publisher. I know that a lot of friends of mine publish on leanpub.com. I myself have done some work on leanpub. That's a much more agile way to publish. It's really a self-publishing platform. But yeah, traditional print books, as soon as the book goes to press, chances are Azure has already changed significantly since. You see what I mean? So what are some alternatives, I guess, to print books? Well, there's always the Azure documentation. I've got a short link in the lower left, timw.info/azdocs. This really is the source of authority, isn't it, for anything Azure related? And as I mentioned earlier, you can get to the Pluralsight Microsoft Azure partnership courses, the free partnership courses from the MS Docs site. If you go under Learn Azure, you'll see Pluralsight right off the menu, okay? Yeah, and this is a good entree to switch over to the demo. The fact that all of the Azure docs are open source. So no matter what it is that you might be learning, I had mentioned Azure Active Directory Connect a little while ago. As you're learning new subjects here, as you prepare, for instance, your Azure Administrator Certification exam or whatnot, I find you can't go wrong by doing a search that takes the form Azure space, whatever the product or concept is, and then space docs. Google is my search engine, and I'm using uBlock Origin to get rid of all the sponsored stuff. So I get to the good stuff right away here. And ultimately, you'll go to somewhere under docs.microsoft.com/Azure. And just some points to ponder here that if you sign in with your Microsoft account, you can edit any of these pages because they're all open sourced at GitHub. I believe I mentioned this last week, but I want to mention it again today. That just by doing something seemingly insignificant, maybe you find a typographical error in one of these Azure articles, or maybe you have an excellent use case that you've actually experienced that you want to add to the article. And if it's a little bit of ramp up because you have to sign a contributor agreement and maybe do a little bit of studying into the Azure Docs, their guidelines. And as you can see at GitHub, it's under Microsoft Docs/Azure Docs. And again, I guess there's a little bit more ramp up yet if you're not yet comfortable with Git source code control or the GitHub workflow. See, but let's see if the page here says it. GitHub account, you'll need one of those. Yeah, so it gives you a full ramp up here. There's you'll need Git. Microsoft recommends that you edit the docs using Visual Studio Code, which is free. And they have their own extension for VS Code called the Docs Authoring Pack. So in other words, if you're interested in contributing to the Azure Docs, a little bit of ramp up, but all of those skills are things that translate 100.00% to the Azure Administrator job role. Think of what we did last week with Azure DevOps. We talked about Git source code control. We talked about GitHub. We talked a little bit about Markdown. All of those skills translate directly into Azure administration. And really, never forget or underestimate that by making contributions to the Azure documentation, you can legitimately and truthfully say on your resume, your CV, and technical interviews that you're an open source contributor. I consider that a badge of honor myself. And, you know, that's kind of cool. Being a Microsoft specialist for a long time, it's a wonderful feeling to be able to contribute to the code base or to a documentation base of Microsoft, which is a company I've been a specialist with for a long, long time. Alrighty then, well, let's come back to PowerPoint and see what's next on our trolley ride here. Show some of my favorite Pluralsight learning tips and tricks. Okay, let me go back to Edge and let's see what we've got here. I've logged into my Pluralsight account, as you can see up here, and a couple ways that we can go. We can go to Paths and take a look for Azure Administrator, as we said before. Let me see if I filter the paths for Azure Admin. There we go. Azure Administrator 103. Quick little pit stop here. Question I receive a lot, totally on base and legitimate question. AZ-103, Microsoft is in process. They've got the AZ-104 exam out. Is this valid? The answer to that question is yes, but. I don't want to say but because there's a saying about using but in your speech. But the truth of the matter there is yes, I mean, it's valid. The differences between AZ-103, which is what I call the V1 version of the Azure Administrator Certification Exam, and AZ-104, they're not quite trivial, but they're not earth-shattering. It takes time for all of us, not just Pluralsight, but for any training provider to ramp up to the next version of an exam. So yes, eventually, I would presume that this path will be renamed to AZ-104 once the AZ-104 exam comes out of beta and into general availability. Something that we take as just a standard operating procedure when we do our Azure training is that we don't cover public preview features. We stay only with generally available features. Now, what does that mean? That means it's all the more important to periodically update the courses. And we have a 6-month review cycle on all of our Azure courses. So I've got like 6 courses on my workbench right now, as a matter of fact, that I'm currently updating. And what happens during these 6-month cycles? Well, we work directly with Microsoft to identify a couple things. One, are there any changes to the underlying job role and job task analysis that we need to make sure to include in the training? And 2, is there anything changed in the associated certification exam? And obviously that case is true for Azure Administrator, so we make sure to incorporate those changes and patch the courses as necessary. Okay, so if we head into the path here, we can add it to a channel, give it a name. I have one called C# development. I could create a channel called Azure Administrator. And then here, this is just showing all of the courses in the path. We would have to go, probably I would go to browse if we wanted to find the skill IQ and the role IQ. But as I mentioned here, we've got beginner, intermediate, advanced. And if you were starting at the raw beginning, if I was starting at the raw beginning here, I would probably want to stay at beginner. What do we have here? We've got managing Azure subscriptions, Azure resource groups, Azure resources, and subscription resource utilization. Which one of these you choose, it's up to you. Now, you'll find that some courses, they might not have formal dependencies, but they're meant to be linked or watched in sequence. This doesn't appear to be the case in this particular situation. Now, you might think to yourself, using Microsoft Azure Resource Groups, for instance, this is a particular course, where might this fit into the exam blueprint, let's say, if you were interested in taking your certification exam? Well, there is a landing page. I don't have the URL right off the top of my head, but somewhere in Pluralsight, I wish I could be more specific. I'll ask Alyssa after class today, and I'll post on my Twitter. I'll get the information out to you one way or the other on a specific mapping of Pluralsight courses to exam objectives. But I generally kind of kick it old school. And what I'll do, for example, is dial up the exam that I'm interested in. In this case, it might be like AZ-103 or AZ-104 if you're interested in taking that, even though it's in beta. And on these Microsoft certification pages, there's the skills measured, which is the source of authority of specifically what's covered on the exam. And you can download a PDF of the specific, what's called objective domain. And there you're going to get a punch list of top-level headings that are called functional groups. Then you've got these second-level headings that are called objectives, I think. And then ultimately you have these individual skills. And this is just something I do. I will copy out the entire OD and put it into a spreadsheet. Really. Let me show you what I mean. If I go to timw.info/AZ900SG, I've got an AZ900 objective domain that I made a spreadsheet for here. And I've put the top level functional group in the first column, and then I list each objective, then I list each skill. I might even want to break it down more than that. You notice here on row 3, I'm saying here, understand terms like high availability, scalability. If I were studying for this particular exam, I might actually put each of these terms on a separate row. You do kind of want to get to that level of granularity here because, well, number one, the exam is going to cover every single one of those bullet points. They really will. They'll at least mention the term. You might not get entire questions devoted to the whole subject, but it'll show up somewhere, you see. And also, remember also that these certifications are aligned to real-world job roles. And I think I told you that the way Microsoft developed, say, the Azure Administrator job role, is that they conducted a job task analysis, getting their engineering team, their Azure engineering team together with subject matter experts and industry people who do Azure administration all day long, and they compiled a list of the skills that Azure administrators actually do in the world here and now. So I submit to you going that extra mile, say, and creating a spreadsheet. And then what I do is once you've got the skills separated into rows, you could do something like take your target date where you plan to take the exam. Let's see, today is June the 10th. Let's say you were going to take it on July 1st or July 10th. You could put that down at the end and then work backwards just to map out, kind of chunk out each day what you need to be looking at, let's say. It's just something that works for me. Again, that's going to be guided by your own learning styles and how much willingness really and availability you have to do all that. Okay, let's make sure here, keeping one eye on the clock to keep up a good pace. What about the subject of hands-on Azure skills? Practice, practice, practice. How do you get to Carnegie Hall, the old joke says? Well, one thing that isn't here yet, but it's something that's definitely worth looking forward to, are Cloud Labs at Pluralsight. And we're working on those both for Azure as well as Amazon Web Services. So that's something to be looked forward to. Right now, here and now, you can use the Microsoft Learn Sandbox. That's fun and free. We'll take a look at that again in demo in just a second. And then there's the Azure free account and sources of free credit. The underlying point here is, okay, cool. I understand how to pick up the theoretical understanding. That's great. So in a tech interview, I might be able to answer a bunch of questions about Azure. But what if that technical interview says, let's sit you down in front of this laptop and let's sign you into our portal and go ahead and do this, 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 this. Then the rubber meets the road. The proof is in the pudding, or insert cliche here. Do you know how to do the work or not? See, and because Azure's business, as I said at the beginning of this session, it's not a situation that I would ever advise you practice in your business's production subscription. So how can you work in a safer, sandboxed environment with low to no cost? That's the goal we're looking at here. First, you should be aware that Azure, I'm really proud and happy to say this, has a number of sources of free credit. I guess I'm talking a bit of smack here, but AWS doesn't. I've researched far and wide, talking to AWS people directly, and I can't think of a single source of credit at AWS. I'm glad to be corrected. But with Azure, there's lots and lots of different credit sources. One, as we'll look at in a second, there's the Azure free account. Another is the Azure Pass, which is a special sponsorship subscription that you get most commonly when you take an Azure class with a Microsoft training provider, a live in-person class, or it could be live online. Oftentimes there you'll get an Azure Pass so you can complete the labs as you're working through the training. Azure Pass is particularly cool because when you redeem it, you do not have to provide a payment method. For the Azure free account, even though you may not have any intention of converting to a pay-as-you-go subscription, you do have to provide a valid payment method, and there's some restrictions on that. The Microsoft Partner Network has a level called Action Pack. It's a little bit of a monetary investment and a little bit of hoops you have to jump through to become a Microsoft partner yourself. But one of the benefits is you get recurring Azure credit, which is nice, recurring every month. MSDN or VS Online, whatever it's called this week, I'm going to go ahead and say MSDN, Microsoft Developer Network. If your business has a subscription to MSDN, that also has a recurring monthly credit for each user of the subscription. There's a couple other programs, BizSpark for startup businesses and DreamSpark for students. Now, I'm not sure if DreamSpark is only K-12 students or if adult learners could be rolled into there. I think you have to have an EDU email address to sign up, but at any rate, those are just a couple other options that include recurring monthly Azure credit that you can take advantage of. I'd mentioned this previously, Microsoft Azure user groups, very useful for a variety of different reasons. If you go to meetup.com and do a search for Azure, nowadays with Zoom, you don't even have to worry about the group meeting in your province, state, city, wherever, because it's all online nowadays, isn't it? You're seeing on the screenshot my own local Nashville Microsoft Azure users group. We've got a lot of members. It's more than 1,500 now, I think. But the meetups are good, whether they're virtual or in person, for professional networking reasons, for educational reasons, for professional opportunity reasons, because headhunters, also called technical recruiters, often make themselves known there because if they're looking for candidates, what better place to go than a technology user group? And then lastly, at least at the Nashville Microsoft Azure Users Group, we run into a pile of Azure passes from time to time, and those serve as a nice incentive, honestly, to have people come to the meeting, and you can walk away with an Azure pass. And what that is, I guess I failed to explain specifically what it is. It's like the free account where you get a monetary or a time equivalent. I think it's 3 months. You'll have to look in the just do a search for Azure Pass and you can read the specifics, but it's credit-based access to Azure, okay? Yeah, there's a screenshot from the Azure Pass homepage, as a matter of fact. All right, let's see here. Meetup, Twitter, LinkedIn, tech conferences. Okay, let's switch over to the demo again. Let me get rid of some of the tabs that I don't need anymore. I'd mentioned Microsoft Learn. Again, the value propositions here are number one, that it's free. Sign in with your Microsoft account, and all of the lessons here are completely free. Another advantage is that you get some of that quantitative documentation of your work. As you complete modules and learning paths at Microsoft Learn, you can print your reports and use those to document your skill development for your current job, progressing with your current employer, your next employer, whoever that may be. And the way I normally go, your mileage may vary, but from the Microsoft Learn homepage, I'll normally hit the Browse All Paths button right up here above the fold. And then in their filter, I normally look at job roles, and they've got a bunch of them, as you can see here. And we've got one called Administrator with, as of today, June 10th, 2020, 361 modules. Wow, that's a lot. The last benefit of these Microsoft Learn modules is the fact that not all of them, but many of them give you sandbox access. And this is kind of a repeat of last week's demo, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. Virtual machine, Windows. I know that in this module, create a Windows virtual machine, there's sandbox access. And notice that you get an estimated time to complete, there's community ratings, and then there's taxonomic tags that give you an idea. And you can bookmark and organize these modules as you step through them. But specifically, let's see here, there's some exercises like this create a Windows virtual machine that allow you to tap into a sandbox. Now this is, it's restricted access, of course. They're not going to turn you loose into their subscription with full owner across the board. It is a restricted access environment, but the value proposition for you is that it's not a simulation or a mock-up. It is the Azure portal. Sometimes the sandbox will be an Azure command line interface prompt. This particular exercise will take us into the honest-to-goodness Azure portal. So if we activate the sandbox, it'll take a little while. There'll be an OAuth consent screen that'll pop up that you have to acknowledge. At least I'm trying to acknowledge it. It's spinning. And it'll show us some metadata. I believe you get 1 hour access per sandbox, and you can redeem up to, well, we'll see in just a second how many sandboxes per day. So the auth consent here is saying that to go to the Microsoft Learn Sandbox, they're going to want to sign us in with our Microsoft account. That's fine. And they're just going to read our name, email address, and photo. What do they care what I look like? Come on. Well, there we go. Okay. A little bit of a spin up time, but not too bad. I will say that although the environment is restricted, of course, you'll be able to complete whatever tasks that are in scope for the exercise. I would imagine that there's some capacity for abuse, so I just want to remind you to be a good steward and make sure that you're using the sandbox environment for the purpose that it was intended for. Otherwise, I believe they can cut your access permanently. So it says time remaining 1 hour, 10 sandboxes for today. More sandboxes will be available tomorrow. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean as of 12:01 a.m. my local time, or is it going to be 24 hours? I've never tested that, but yeah, at this point, we can click into the Azure portal here, and what's notable here is that we're going to hit, let me open this up. What directory are we in? Yeah, Microsoft Learn Sandbox. You see that in the upper right corner of the portal? So at this point, we're in the Azure portal, and we would follow along with that exercise, doing our work. And it's all real. I mean, that's fantastic. I mean, that is real hands-on Azure experience. And so if you're asked in a job interview if you know how to do such and so of a task, you can say with full authority and honesty, yes, I absolutely have. Now, question that I remember from last week or the week before, how do you leverage your inexperience in this context? Let's say you've broken into IT not too long ago and you've done, say, some support stuff, and now you want to become an Azure administrator. And so your task is going to be to win an interview. To pass the initial human resources screening can sometimes be the biggest barrier to entry, because if the screener sees that you don't have any experience yet in the Azure administrator domain, they might circular file you right away. How to work around that? I don't think it's controversial to say that professional networking is invaluable. I'm talking about making professional contacts through technology user groups, through LinkedIn, through Twitter, not with an eye towards manipulation and deceit, but just general good faith intercommunication. And I'm telling you, I've been an IT professional for about 21 years or so. The majority of my professional engagements have come through professional networking, either an acquaintance or a colleague or a friend through discussions. Oh, and they make me realize, oh, we're actually looking for an Azure administrator right now. Oh, yeah, really? Or, you know, I have a friend, and she said that their business is getting into, see, would you mind introducing me? Those are invaluable connections. And I don't know even why I'm being kind of tentative in my speech. I'm not suggesting that you try to short circuit the HR screeners or anything like that, but let's face it, those professional connections can be extraordinarily helpful. I mean, it's one thing for a human resources screener who may not be technical at all, just to look at your application, see that he or she can't check a couple boxes and then dismiss you. But when you've got a professional connection and a human contact, they're able to take in more than what's printed on a piece of paper, for heaven's sake. Yeah, Tim, he's new to Azure. He's kind of new to IT, but he's new to Azure admin, but he really, I know him a little bit, and I can vouch for the fact that he's really a go-getter. He's a fast learner. I think we might want to take a chance on this guy. And that's really what you're looking for, in my humble opinion. If you're new to this, or if you're new just to Azure and Azure administration, It's a question of finding the business, the people that are willing to take a chance on you and give you your break. Because once you've done that, then you're good, because then you'll be developing real road miles with Azure administration, and you'll never again be in that situation of having to pass a human resources screening just to make sure that you've got these boxes checked. You see what I mean? But I have to say, even after being in the industry a long time, professional networking is still principal for me. Anyway, let's see. Next, I want to switch on over to another Azure portal instance. And once you're in the Azure portal, something I think not a whole lot of people know, if you type free of all terms, look what happens in the service list. There's a blade called Free Services. Then there's Education and Quick Start Center. Isn't that cool? What's on Education? These look like they're Microsoft Learn modules that are accessible directly from within the Azure portal. That's pretty sweet, isn't it? But let me go back to free. I originally wanted to show you the Free Services blade because the free account, it takes as its inspiration AWS. They did it first, that idea of giving you certain services free for 12 months and then some features that are always free. And you can get to this if you go to azure.com. As a matter of fact, I've already done it. If you do a search for Azure free account, you'll come to this page where it says create your Azure free account today. And what happens when you step through this wizard is a couple things. You'll either need to create a Microsoft account if you don't already have one, or you'll associate your existing Microsoft account with Azure, and then you'll complete a sign up. Now, as I mentioned, the free account does require a payment method, but it's not actually for the reason that you might think. Microsoft will not, and I repeat, will not automatically convert your account from the free tier to pay as you go. It's just that when you reach the end of your free, any services that aren't qualified for free at that point will stop. And in order to get them back online, you'll have to convert. But they won't, Microsoft will not do that for you, all right? The reason why Microsoft insists on a payment method is simply to authenticate your identity and to prevent fraud or reduce the likelihood of fraud, making sure that, you know, if you have multiple credit cards, the same customer doesn't try to redeem the free trial multiple times. As a matter of fact, look what happened here. Azure sees that my email ID, my Microsoft account, has already done this. So it says that the Azure free account is only available to new users and is limited to one per customer. Now, once you're in, that is, once you do your sign up, and one more thing about that, the payment method actually has to be an honest-to-goodness credit or debit card. You can't use one of those prepay cards, unfortunately, because I have friends and colleagues who are philosophically opposed to credit cards, let's say, and they wonder if they could go to a drugstore and buy a prepaid Visa card. No, and again, it's because of the identity verification aspect of it, okay? Once you've got your sign up complete, you're taken into the portal. You're going to be the owner of a new free tier subscription. You'll be attached, your subscription will be attached to your own Azure Active Directory tenant that's called Default Directory by default. And the notion of the free tier is that you get $200 US or your equivalent to spend over the course of 30 days. And if you burn up the money before the 30 days, you're done. Or otherwise, if you're being really conservative with what you deploy and break down, when you reach day 31, you're done. At that point, you can do the services that have free use for up to 12 months, and then after you're on day 366, these go away. And then, as I said, there's a subset of services that are always free. For example, the Azure App Service. You can have up to 10 web apps. Now, those would be at the very lowest app service plan tier, of course. And none of this is meant or intended for business use. Remember, ultimately, Microsoft is a business, a for-profit business, and they want you to use the free tier as an incentive to go further and to convert, and also for your business, for you to consider using Azure for your line of business applications and services. Simple as that. Okay, so that's the dealio here with the free tier, and that's something to that you can redeem once, as I said. If you've already burned your free account, then you're going to want to go the next step and look for other credit sources. Like I said, depending upon what you and your organization belong to, like MSDN or Visual Studio Online, whatever the heck it's called today. Like I said, I'm Visual Studio subscriptions. Like I've signed into my subscription account. And right here, look, it's right on the home page, that if you have a Visual Studio license or an MSDN license, you can log into the portal, my.visualstudio.com, and I can light up this 150 USD monthly credit right here. And that would be valid for as long as I'm a user in this Visual Studio Enterprise subscription, you see? So there are good sources of free credit available, for sure. All right, let's see what else do we have in here. Oh my gosh, well, we've got 2 minutes left. Let's see if I can do anything else. Let me go back to the portal. Now, as you're studying, as you're learning, as you're deploying stuff and working in the Azure portal, let me stay here. There's some help that you can get directly from the portal. Let's say you're working with virtual machines, or let's say you're having trouble with networking and TCP/IP configuration. And so in the global search bar in the Azure portal, you type, in this case, network interfaces. You're going to see documentation links directly here. So don't ignore that. This is context sensitive directly in the portal. Documentation links, add network interfaces to or remove from Azure VMs. And again, that's going to take you back to the docs, which are editable and open source, but you'll want to become a master of using the docs. And what I like is good old Control F. If I'm looking for IP address information and zipping through the document that way. All of the documents in the Azure Docs have the standard format. In this article, headings, and then at the end, there'll be next steps. And I rely on those very, very heavily. Oftentimes, the end of that article will lead very naturally into what you want to do next, and you'll have options to choose from here. And my understanding is that some of the entries here are generated with a machine learning algorithm, so they may evolve over time. This looks like a statically composed table, but anyway, that would be that. I used to be impressed by the fact that the Azure Docs are downloadable. You see in the table of contents tree over on the left, there's this download PDF. Now I don't find that impressive at all. I mean, I guess if I were going to take a long plane ride and I didn't think I would have Wi-Fi and I needed to learn something, that's a nice option. But the docs are a living entity. The rendering's pretty good here, as you can see. It's a living document, really, and it's updatable over time. Homework, and then we'll do questions. Look up a virtual Microsoft Azure user group. Doesn't have to be in your area. Introduce yourself. Secondly, look for Azure Administrator job roles on tech recruiting sites. Dice.com would be a good one to start. LinkedIn jobs would be a second one. And third, consider becoming more active in a Microsoft technical community. Twitter, LinkedIn, Slack, Discord. Ask around. That will accomplish two things. One, you'll get into some of these other communities. Two, you're practicing your professional networking skills. And who knows, you might strike up some new friendships. Awesome sauce. Well, Alyssa, I'm going to go back to my question slide here if I can find it. There we go. Do we have any questions in the queue at this point?
Yep, we have a bunch. First one, Tim, my organization is evaluating the use of Pluralsight versus CBT nuggets. Could you speak to any of the differences and benefits of Pluralsight over CBT nuggets?
Yeah. Okay. Well, how can I start? Because I know a lot about both companies. I'm actually one of the few times I feel I'm at a loss for words. Okay, let me rephrase it this way. I'm going to speak just as a fellow learner, okay, not as a Pluralsight author and as an instructor. Pluralsight made its bones originally with development and .NET development, and now we range really far and wide. So from a size comparison, there really is no comparison. I personally consider CBT Nuggets to be more of a boutique computer-based training or CBT provider. They've got a very small stable of instructors. If you look at them and vibe with those instructors, then I would say go in that direction. Number two, as a boutique provider, CBT Nuggets has historically been pretty strong in the Cisco networking space principally, and I guess I'd put Microsoft after that, but predominantly I would say it's Cisco stuff. Try them both and see what you like. Pluralsight definitely has the breadth and depth, both in terms of our library size, our content coverage, and we have so many authors. Seems like it would be impossible for you to not find some that you really vibe with.
Thanks, Tim.
Mm-hmm.
Next up, if you were short on time, would you skip AZ 900 and go straight to AZ 103 or 104?
Well, if you are in fact an administrator and that is your end goal, or at least your near to midterm end goal, then I would say, yeah. In terms of distilled impact, in my opinion, the Azure administrator has higher net impact than Azure Fundamentals, because the Azure Fundamentals was developed to be a general beginner introduction to Azure. And actually the audience for AZ900 is not even necessarily technical people. Microsoft designed all the 900 series exams to be approachable to non-technical people who need to have a general understanding. So I guess, yeah, if you are an administrator and time is of the essence, might as well cut right to 103 or 104.
Is there a direct link to Microsoft Sandbox? This person says that they always have to search on Bing or Google.
I would suggest that you get to that sandbox only through Microsoft Learn. I'm not sure, I don't know if you can directly address the sandbox. I believe the entry point would be only through the Microsoft Learn site, and that is microsoft.com/learn.
If you were to get a book for AZ 300 and 301, what books would you recommend?
Okay, if you were going to get a book. My first thought is the Microsoft Press exam refs, only because they're written specifically to the exam objectives. So for instance, if we do a search for exam ref AZ 300, it should take us to the Amazon and the Microsoft Press store. Yeah, I mean, those are good because they're aligned directly to the exam objectives. They're being updated right now, as a matter of fact. I'm not part of the revision for AZ 303 and 304, but I was a co-author here of AZ 300. So I can attest that those books are specifically written for the exam objectives. Other than Microsoft Press, I'm not sure I'm aware of any big publishers that go into exam prep because Azure is so volatile. It's pretty dangerous, to be perfectly honest with you. Let me think. I think it's PACT, P-A-C-K-T, that has a huge book library in Azure, not aligned to the exams, but the actual skills. So you could have a look at them if you are a true blue book learner and you're not committed to exam prep. But for the exam prep specifically, I would say go for the Microsoft Press exam refs.
Okay, got it. And are those exam ref books good for Azure tests? This is from another user.
Well, yeah, I mean, like I said, the table of contents of these exam refs comes from the blueprint or the objective domain directly, literally. We as authors took the OD directly from Microsoft Learning and we split it up, who's writing what, and that's how the chapters are separated. But of course, the downside is that Microsoft Worldwide Learning tweaks those outlines every 2 months, and they revisit the certification every year. And this whole business with AZ300 and AZ301 evolving into AZ303 and 304 is a function of the V1 exams reaching their 1-year mark and Worldwide Learning going back and doing quite a bit of hacking, slashing, and reorganizing. So like I said, Microsoft Press is working right now. I'm not sure where they are, but I know that they're working on the updates. I don't know what the publication date is of the 303 and 304, but eventually they'll be released, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't see a publication date yet for when I checked it out.
Okay.
Okay, next one. Can you resend the link to your Excel spreadsheet objectives, etc. for AZ900?
Okay. That is, let me just put it in on the slide. The short link is timw.info az900sg. And so what this will give you is an idea of how you can take the objective domain for a Microsoft exam, or really any exam, and convert it into a format that I find to be more easily digestible. I mean, if I'm studying to take a Microsoft exam, I'm not going to get hung up on that blueprint document. No, I like having each skill separated, and you can literally check them off as you go through. I just feel that that's infinitely preferable.
Okay. Our next one goes into wanting to be an Azure DevOps expert. So if you had to choose one associate exam with that goal in mind, would you choose the AZ-104, the administrator, or the AZ-204 development?
Great question. Yeah, the Azure DevOps expert, let me see, Azure DevOps expert certification. I'm trying to get a particular image. Let's see if Google Images has what I'm looking for. Yeah, this is what I'm looking for right here. Chris Peachman, build59s.com. This is a good website to be aware of. Come on, is it not here? Here it is, okay. Yeah, the Azure DevOps Engineer Expert is interesting because it's the only Azure certification exam that has a prerequisite to it. None of the other ones do. You have to have either the Azure Administrator Associate or the Azure Developer Associate in order to qualify. Now, you can take your exams in either order. That is, you can take the AZ400, that's the DevOps Engineer exam first, and then do either the administrator or the developer, it doesn't matter. But you won't get your Azure DevOps Engineer Expert badge until Microsoft sees both passing scores. Now, specifically to your question, well, let me put it to you this way. One, I can't answer, only you can. If your skill set skews significantly toward one or the other of those, then I would say your natural choice would be to do either the administrator or the developer based on that. If not, or if you don't have a preference, I would actually say go for the administrator, because I've taken all of these exams, and thinking back over the AZ400 DevOps, I would say that there was more administrator type stuff on that exam than developer type stuff. So take that for what it's worth.
Next up, so how does AZ-300, AZ-301 compare to the AZ DevOps Exam 400?
I would say the overlap is limited. You know, the thing about the AZ400, the Azure DevOps Engineer Expert certification, is that, at least for me, it wasn't what I thought it would be. I thought that it involved a lot of understanding of DevOps processes and methodology, but you know what it really is, and this is a semi-controversial opinion, it's basically a product familiarity exam is what it is. The AZ400 tests your proficiency using the Azure DevOps tools that we looked at in last week's session. Really. So in one way, to be really kind of playful about this, the AZ400 DevOps exam is almost like taking a Microsoft Office specialist exam. You know how you might take an exam to demonstrate that you have expertise with Word or Excel? Really, it's kind of like that. So I would say that there's quite limited overlap between the Azure Architect exams and Azure DevOps. Now, one thing to note about the Azure Architect exams and the Administrator exam is that the V1 versions of those exams have huge overlap. The AZ300 and AZ301, there's got to be 40+% overlap between those. And the overlap between those two original Azure Architect exams and the original Azure Administrator exam, AZ103, again, I would put it 35 to 40%. That's one of the main reasons why Microsoft Worldwide Learning developed the AZ104 for Administrator and 303 and 304 for Architect, was to eliminate that overlap. So what I tell students is, if you're on the fence of which version to take and you want them both, hurry up and take advantage of that momentum and the overlap that does currently exist between Azure Administrator and Azure Architect.
Our next one is, let's see, is my certification path right? AZ900 to AZ104 to AZ204 to AZ500 to become strong at technical knowledge as an Azure admin. They're currently an on-prem IT right now.
Mm-hmm. That sounds fine to me. If you've got the cashola and the time and the willingness to do all that, I mean, that makes sense totally logically, especially if you're newer to the technology. I'm a big fan of the Microsoft Fundamentals exam, skill set, and certification. I really am. I found I took it after I took several other Azure exams. I still was extremely pleased, and I felt probably more elated coming out of that exam than I did with some of the associates. It's a really nice general skill set of Azure. So yeah, starting with fundamentals and then moving to the associate level there, the common ones would be administrator, developer. Security is definitely a good, solid skill set. And then perhaps at the expert level, the solutions architect or the DevOps engineer. Yeah, it sounds really solid. Good for you if you're able to do all that.
Our next one says, how important is PowerShell skill for AZ103 or real-life administration work? And then the second part of that question is if you have any resources that you would recommend for learning PowerShell.
Yeah, as a general advisement, I suggest to all my students that if you're doing any of the associate or expert Azure exams, you should have intermediate level PowerShell, not beginner. It used to be way back when, say in 2007, 2008, that the Microsoft certification exams would just have PowerShell commandlet names and you needed to understand which one. It's not like that. You're going to see quite a bit of Azure PowerShell on all of the exams, including Azure Developer, and you're going to see the code in context. You're not going to see isolated commandlets. You're going to see scripts that you're going to need to interpret. You won't be writing the code, but you'll need to understand exactly what it's doing. And like I said, it requires an intermediate level of skill such that if you see variables, if you see pipelines, if you see conditional logic, if statements, you're going to see real-world Azure PowerShell. The good news there is that by investing in PowerShell, getting up to speed with PowerShell in an Azure context, you're going to be up to speed with PowerShell in any context because that's the value proposition of PowerShell. It's a task automation language that has a general standard syntax. And once you understand the mechanics of, say, the Azure pipeline and how to discover commands and how to get help and how to string together these things, you can apply them not only to Azure, but to AWS, to Google, to Windows Server, across the board. Now, what about suggestions for getting that intermediate level of PowerShell skills? Here, question one is going to be, how do you learn the best, like we said before? My friend and Pluralsight colleague, Michael Bender, has a Pluralsight course called, let me see if I can find it for us now, Pluralsight PowerShell, I think it's called PowerShell Fundamentals. It's a very popular course in our library. Maybe it's called Windows PowerShell Essentials. No, I don't think it would. Let me see. This looks like we've got an entire path for PowerShell Essentials. Michael Bender, PowerShell Getting Started. I believe that's the course I want you to look at. And Jeff Hicks is one of the foremost experts in PowerShell, and he's got a whole bunch of PowerShell training in our library. So certainly we've got you covered, beginner, intermediate, and advanced PowerShell directly in our library. There's some more Jeff stuff, and then advanced. And there's a lot more than just what you see there. Now, if you're more of a book learner, a reader, writer, a mind mapper, the standard text for that is Don Jones and Jeff Hicks' book, Learn Windows PowerShell in a Month of Lunches, from Manning. Manning is one of the book publishers that I most admire because they really know how to walk that line of publishing print books on technologies that are iterating all the time. They're really good about that. And here's the situation with this. The third edition is the last edition of this. There's another book that's called, I think it's called just Learn PowerShell in a Month of Lunches, written by some different folks. It doesn't seem to have the search engine relevancy that Don's book does. I guess you could find it just with a site search, but this is Don and Jeff's book. It's foundational. It's focusing on Windows PowerShell, but don't let that dissuade you if you use a Mac or Linux, because Don and Jeff are covering the foundational skills. They will bring you definitely to that intermediate level where you've gone beyond commands and pipelines and you've gotten into scripting. It's all very nice stepwise format. And just because my curiosity is bothering me, let me see if I can find that other one. Here it is. Learn PowerShell in a Month of Lunches. Looks like it's only half written. I was hoping it'd be further along. But Manning lets you look at the manuscript as the authors put it together. So Travis Plunk and Tyler Leonhardt, I believe, is a PowerShell team member at Microsoft. But this is the next generation of that book, and they're focusing on PowerShell 7 and cross-platform PowerShell. Hope that gave you a good head start.
One of our learners also asked, after the 103, is it more logical to go to that 500, the security one, or to the 301, the architect?
Is it more logical? It's really a tough question. It depends on your own professional skills and your goals. I mean, especially with Azure. Remember, if you've been following these seminar sessions throughout, you remember I gave a semi-tongue-in-cheek definition of the Azure Administrator job role, and I said that you're basically your business's subject matter expert, or SME. So although you officially might be an Azure Administrator, you might realize you're doing more architecture than you are administration, or you're working so tightly with your security people, you've become the de facto SME for Azure security. So I would say let your current position, your future, your ideal position guide your decision. But they're separate but related skill sets. Administration fits hand in glove with security, and both administration and security fit hand in glove with solutions architect. So I'm afraid to say that the job roles are much more fluid than you might think, the fact that Microsoft has broken those out into discrete certifications.
Our next question goes back to when you stated that Pluralsight courses are revamped every 6 months, some of them. They're following the AZ administrator path right now, and they're curious to know if you know how learners might get updates on any updates that already happened.
Yeah, well, you hit me right in the feels there with that question, because that's a question that I have myself, to be honest with you, because I'm not sure that it lights up in the courses. Like I mentioned earlier, I've got 6 courses on my workbench now, and in some of them, I'm adding a module to the course. And for you, the learner, when you dial up my course, I don't know if the interface has an updated badge. That's something I don't know. Do you happen to know, Alyssa?
I
No?
don't. I was trying to Google to see if we have any documentation on it, but you know what? I'll look around over the next week and see if we can bring an answer to that next week.
Great, yes, definitely. Because your question is absolutely germane. You may have studied such and so a course, and you want to go back and see if there's anything changed. Totally appropriate and reasonable, and I understand. I'm glad we're following up for you. That's all the more incentive for you to join us next week if you can.
Okay. The next one reads, why does Microsoft require the administrator exam before DevOps, though the current increased market requires the DevOps skill even for data science folks?
Yeah, well, that's a question officially for Microsoft Worldwide Learning, how they structured that. Yeah, I mean, I see your point, but I guess if you look at the words development and operations and you combine them to DevOps, hence, maybe that gives you a little bit of insight into what Microsoft Worldwide Learning was thinking. I don't know, I can't answer for them, but that is the requirement, and I haven't heard any rumblings that that's going to change in the future, I'm afraid. Your point's valid, because you may be a machine learning expert or a data platform expert, and you want to qualify as a DevOps expert. It's like, are you going to really have to go and do an administrator exam or a development exam? And unfortunately, the non-negotiable answer to that question as of today is yes.
The next learner would like to know if it's a good idea to take a Visual Studio course if they want to take the architecture path.
The architect exam covers development, but not to the level of depth to where you're coding in Visual Studio. Instead, the architecture is going to have you look at products more from a planning standpoint. You know, you're working with a development team who plans to design a .NET or a Node or a Java app that will run in Azure. What would you recommend that they use? Platform as a service, infrastructure as a service? What messaging or event pipeline stuff or machine learning stuff would you recommend to them? You see? So the focus is different. When I teach the Azure architecture courses, I use Visual Studio predominantly when we're looking at deployment templates. Understanding the JSON, you can use Visual Studio all day long as a JSON editor for deployment templates. And maybe I'll use it to demonstrate deploying a web app into Azure, but no, I would have you concentrate elsewhere if your focus is Azure architecture. And if you're going to look at development courses, look at the fundamentals level ones just to get a feel for how Azure development works, because that's what you'll need for the architect, a feel for what's possible and the general, most common and preferred patterns to do software development in Azure.
Our last one, it looks like for now, unless others trickle in, is do you recommend any practice tests? For example, Wiz Labs or any others which are close to the Microsoft exams?
Yeah, I do. We'll get more into it next week in the last session. In Pluralsight, depending upon your subscription level, you may have access to the practice exams that we've partnered with. It's Kaplan IT, now they're called Cyber Vista, I believe. But if I just quickly dial up a course page here, I'm just pseudo-randomly grabbing one. Let me see, maybe it's on the paths page. It can be hard to click out to the correct link. Let me see if I can find it. There we go. Yeah, so it looks like on the Azure Administrator path page, down at the, the bottom here, we can click out to the Cyber Vista / Kaplan IT. The good thing generally about these practice exams is that they're going to give you some confidence in taking a computer-based evaluation. Number two, you're going to get a feel for how Microsoft will assess your knowledge. Number three, it just gives you practice. No better way to say it than that. So the Kaplan are one thing. It's convenient if you're already a Pluralsight subscriber. If you're not and you're looking for a good product, the two main ones I recommend are measurup.com. That's Microsoft's official practice test provider. And I also recommend, as you said, wizlabs.com. Comparison between the two, MeasureUp is superior in terms of the item types, much more closely match what you'll see on the Microsoft tests. The case studies, the interactive items, all of that kind of stuff. But the downside is MeasureUp's quite a bit more expensive than, say, WizLabs. WizLabs, I think I paid like $10 US for the AZ400, and they give you like 5 practice tests. MeasureUp, I think, are running at least $100 US, and I think you get 3 full-length practice exams. But a good practice exam product is going to give you good explanations. So, because the point here is not memorization. Please understand, that's not in scope for any of this stuff. You're going to see questions that discuss real-world business scenarios, and you need to take your knowledge, synthesize it to answer these questions. And so you'll be looking at these questions not only to give you confidence in taking and passing the Microsoft exam, but in a best case scenario, you can learn some good stuff by reviewing these practice exams, reading the explanations, and then clicking out. Both MeasureUp and WizLabs in the explanations will click out to the Azure Docs. So if you still have some unanswered questions, hopefully you can satisfy those in the documentation.
Our final question is, I am AZ 900 certified. My goal is architect expert. Should I skip AZ 104 or go straight to AZ 300 and 301?
Congrats on your Azure fundamentals. Well, remember that you're going to need the administrator or the developer as a prerequisite. You can take the AZ400 first, but you're not going to receive your badge, your Azure DevOps Expert badge, until you've passed both exams. So which one you choose, again, is going to come down to your interests, your skills, your time horizon. Let me see, if I were really to come down with a top of the head suggestion, I might say go for AZ400 first because it's more stable. You know, both the Azure developer and the Azure administrator have undergone this revision where now the AZ104 is in beta or pre-release, and the Azure developer replacement, I don't know if that's in general availability or still in beta. Let me just quickly check. Exam AZ204. Yeah, it looks like that the replacement exam for the Azure developer has already gone into general availability. So now it's AZ204. So if you're looking for stability, AZ400 has been pretty stable over the last several months. Developer looks like it's on V2, and administrator, it's V1 or V2, depending upon which way you want to go. I hope that that gave you at least a little bit of clarity.
And going off of that, so if they do get the AZ104 first, are they still required to take AZ300 and 301?
No, the only
Okay.
prerequisite is the relationship between the AZ400, the Azure DevOps. That one you have to have either the Azure administrator or the Azure developer in addition to passing the AZ400 DevOps exam. The architect is the 300 series, and there's no prerequisites. You could take the architect exams tomorrow if you wanted to.
And while we aren't out of time just yet, we are out of questions. So we're at the end of our session. We'll see everyone next Wednesday. Thanks, Tim, for teaching us.
You're welcome, Melissa. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I look forward to seeing you next time.